Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Karen's, and this is a lecture on the components that you find within the integumentary system, or the things that you find in your skin. The first of these is hair, basically made of keratinized cells, dead keratinized cells, much like the epidermis. What does hair do? It can warn you of things on your skin, like insects. It can help prevent heat loss, and it can shield you from sunlight. Let's look at the structure of a hair. So here we've got basically a chunk of skin. You can see here is the epidermis up here. Underneath that is the dermis, and here you see the hairs. The hair originates in the dermis, particularly in the reticular layer, and grows up out past the surface of the skin. So the piece of the hair that is above the skin or outside of the skin is the hair shaft, whereas anything under the skin, under the surface, is the hair root, and that root can extend down into deep into the dermis there. Some things to look at. I'm thinking of what's on your lab checklist. So we have hair shaft, hair root underneath the surface. What encases the root is the follicle, and that's really what's kind of helping to produce and nourish the living cells of the hair root. And just like in the epidermis, where you saw that stratum basale layer actively dividing and pushing up old cells up and up and up to the stratum corneum, the hair works the same way. It's the cells that are deep in the root that are actively dividing, and they're pushing up old cells up past the surface of the skin. So the follicle is surrounding that root. The part of the follicle, or the deepest part of the follicle that has this bulb shape, is the hair bulb. So the hair bulb is part of the hair follicle. So it's a more kind of specific location of the hair follicle. And what you will find surrounding the hair bulb are these nerve endings here. This is called the hair follicle receptor, or the root hair plexus. And that is what allows, if you go back to one of those functions of the skin, it says warns you of insects on your skin. You know, if you have something like a mosquito, it's super light. If you didn't have hair on your skin, you might not even know it landed on you. But if it lands on you and it disturbs the hair on your skin, that hair moves. Well, it's this hair follicle receptor that picks up on that movement, and that allows you to know that something landed on you. Here's a few other images of a structure of a hair, and again, pointing out the things I just mentioned. The follicle itself is actually quite thick. It completely surrounds the hair root. And if you look down here, you can even see another layer here kind of underneath the follicle. This white thin layer here is called the cuticle. And within that, you're going to find the hair root itself. And I talked about the hair follicle receptor. That pretty much is what you need to know about hair. For nails, again, similar. Think of the epidermis of your skin and think of what we just talked about with hair. Your nails are kind of doing the same kind of thing. You have these dead, kind of keratinized cells here, really tough, really hard, originating at a root where the living cells are. And as the living cells multiply and divide, they push the old cells up or forward, and that's what makes your nail. Why do we even have nails? So nails, evolutionarily, they came from claws. We don't really use our nails like some animals use their claws, which would be like for digging and things like that. But they do help us with our sense of touch and pressure, because your fingertips are pretty sensitive, and you have this hard plate basically on top of those fingertips. When you press your hands down on a surface, those fingertips are pushing up against those hard nails, and that's detected as pressure and touch, so it helps with that. What are the parts of the nail that you need to know? I'm going off of memory from the lab checklist, so if I miss something, I apologize, but here are the things that I remember. The main part of the nail is the nail plate. At the very edge, or the tip of your nail, is the free edge, and then the root of the nail, you look down here, is actually underneath the skin. The cuticle, let's go here. The cuticle here, which is that thin layer of skin that if you don't continue to push those cuticles back or get your cuticles removed, they can eventually grow over the top of your nail. That's called the eponychium. And again, that's tissue. It's probably there for some type of protection. And I think that's pretty much it. Oh, the nail bed, I should say. The nail bed is the tissue of your actual finger that is just under the nail. And if you've ever broken a nail, and I don't mean just broken off the tip, but like if a nail completely kind of tore off, that nail bed is very sensitive. And then this thing here, phalanx. The phalanx is a finger or a toe bone. So here is the bone of your finger. You can see how close it does come to that nail bed and to that nail. All right, so those are nails. And let me talk about glands. So the main glands that we find in our skin are sweat glands, called sudoriferous glands, and then sebaceous or oil glands. Let's talk about sudoriferous glands. You find sweat glands almost everywhere on your body. There are two types, eccrine, also called merocrine, and apocrine. Glands in general, this would be considered an exocrine gland because the cells within the gland are producing something that is getting released onto the surface of something. And in a sweat gland case, sweat is getting produced by the glands and being released onto the surface of the skin, as opposed to releasing something directly into the bloodstream. So these eccrine or merocrine sweat glands, these are, here's one highlighted right here. The shape of the gland itself, and a gland is really like a tube or a cavity lined with epithelial cells. In this case, the shape of the eccrine gland is long and tubular. And notice that when you follow the duct of that gland, it empties out onto the surface of the skin. So the sweat will be produced down here in the gland, in the eccrine gland, and find its way up onto the surface of the skin. The type of sweat that an eccrine gland produces is mostly water. There's some salt in there and a couple other things. The function of an eccrine gland, thermoregulation, so regulating your body temperature. Heat gets released with the sweat. So when you get hot, one way to get rid of your heat is to sweat and bring that heat away from inside of you. It lands within that sweat on your skin and then it evaporates away. Apocrine sweat glands, let me show you a picture. Let me go back. Okay, so in our textbook, they don't show you a picture of an apocrine gland, but I can show you what that looks like in a model in the lab. So an apocrine sweat gland is, you'll only find those in certain areas of the body, axillary area and the anogenital areas. And they usually become functional at puberty. They are producing sweat, but it's not as watery. So it's thicker, more milky-ish, contains some fat in it. And that when that gets released onto the skin, the bacteria on your skin breaks down that sweat, and that's what can lead to different body odors. What is different about an apocrine sweat gland compared to an eccrine sweat gland? First, let me just again point out to you, an eccrine sweat gland, long and tubular, the duct empties out onto the surface of the skin. Apocrine sweat glands can also be long and tubular like that, but instead of emptying directly onto the surface of the skin, that long tube will empty onto a hair follicle or a hair shaft instead, really a hair follicle, hair root. And again, they don't show those in this picture, but we do have a model in the lab that shows you what that looks like. So apocrine sweat glands, long, tubular, but empty into a hair follicle. Yeah, they really don't show a picture. Okay. Now, those were sweat glands. Sebaceous glands or oil glands. These are secreting sebum, which is an oily substance. It's got some bacterial killing properties to it, and it can help soften your hair and your skin. So oil is actually good for your skin. It maintains the integrity of your skin, maintains that barrier against infection. So we want to have oil glands. These are, oh, here's a great picture. I'll come to this in a second. Oil glands are connected to a hair follicle as well, just like the apocrine sweat gland was. But how do you tell the difference? So I forgot about this picture. I'm glad this is in your book. So this is in chapter 5 of the textbook, and it shows you the difference of these 3 major types of glands. So again, eccrine sweat gland, long and tubular, empties onto the surface of the skin. An apocrine sweat gland, also long and tubular, but empties onto a hair follicle. Whereas a sebaceous gland or an oil gland, while it also empties onto a hair follicle, it is not long and tubular like you saw with the apocrine or eccrine sweat glands. It is shorter, it is more bulb-looking, fat, short, bulbous, not long and tubular. So when you're looking at these, if you're looking at what looks like a gland, first, see where it empties onto. If it empties onto the surface of the skin, you know it's an eccrine sweat gland. If it empties onto a hair follicle, okay, now you have to figure out, is it an oil gland or is it an apocrine sweat gland? Look, is it long and tubular? Apocrine sweat gland. Is it short, fat, and bulbous looking? You know it's a sebaceous gland. And then the last thing I want to talk about are just some of the functions of the skin. I'm not going to go into these in detail because you can read this on yourself. But just keep in mind, why do we have our skin? It is a barrier. And when you start learning about the immune system, you're going to find out that our first line of defense against bacterial infections, fungal infections, what have you, our first line of defense is our skin. So it's really there for protection, which is why it's important to maintain the integrity of our skin. If it gets too dry, it's prone to cracking. And if it cracks, that's how things like bacteria get inside. So we need to protect our skin so it can protect us. It can also help with body temperature regulation, like you saw with our eccrine sweat glands. And there are different sensory receptors that you find within the dermis of our skin. And if you look in the lab, this would be lab 6, they talk about what some of those sensory receptors are. There are some metabolic functions that occur in the skin. It serves as a blood reservoir, and it helps us get rid of some wastes via sweat. And that's really all I'm going to talk about. So those were the other kind of accessory components of our skin. We talked about hair, we talked about nails, we talked about glands, we talked a little bit about the functions of the skin.